All right, let's talk about lazy loading. Lazy loading is a strategy for loading client components or third-party libraries in the future when we need them, typically as a result of a user interaction, like when the user clicks on a button or scrolls beyond a certain point. Let me show you a real example. So in this lesson, we're going to go in the app/components folder and create a component. I'm going to call this heavy component. Let's imagine this is a heavy component with a lot of markup, with a lot of styles and JavaScript code. So let's create a basic React component. Now I'm going to change the label here to my heavy component, so later we can look it up in our JavaScript bundle. So here we have a heavy component. Now we're going to add this to our homepage. So let's go to our homepage and add it right here, heavy component. Okay, now back to the browser, refresh. Here's our heavy component. This could be a rich editor or any component that has a lot of code. Now let me show you something. Let's bring up DevTools here on the network tab, filter by JavaScript, and look at, well, we don't have a page file here because our homepage is currently a server component. So to make it a client component, first we have to add the client directive. And also we should remove async from here because at the time of this video, client components cannot be async. Now, back in the browser, refresh. Now we have a page file here, and this file contains all the JavaScript code for rendering this page. Now, if you look at this bundle and search for my heavy component, look, that heavy component is included right here. Now, let's say we don't want to show this heavy component right away. Perhaps we want to show it when the user clicks on a button. So there is no reason to include this large heavy component in our bundle ahead of time because that bundle has to be downloaded and executed by the browser to render this page. So we can postpone the loading of the heavy component to the future. To do that, first we add a button here. Let's call it show. Now here we handle the click event. Now here we need a state variable for showing the heavy component. So we use the state hook. We initialize this variable to false. Let's call it is visible, and the function to update it set visible. All right. Now, when the user clicks on this button, we set visible to true, and then we dynamically render this heavy component. So if is visible is true, then we render it. Now with this implementation, the heavy component is still included in our bundle. So if we bring up the network tab, let's refresh. Let's search for my heavy component. Look, it's still included here, even though we are showing it dynamically because this component is statically imported on the top. So when Next.js builds our application, it adds this component in the bundle for this page. Now, to lazy load this, we have to use the dynamic function in Next.js. So first we import the dynamic function from next/dynamic. Then, instead of importing the heavy component statically, we use the dynamic function to import it dynamically. So we call this function and give it a loader function. So we pass a function. In this function, we use the import function to load the heavy component. So we give it a path, just like before, we go to the components folder and load the heavy component. This returns our component, so we store it in a constant called heavy component. Let me break this line. So this is how we lazy load components using the dynamic function. Now look what happens. Back to the page, refresh. Let's bring up DevTools. So if you look at the code for this page, we no longer have my heavy component here. However, if we click on the show button, now look, we have a separate request to the server to download the heavy component. That is right here. Okay. Now, in this case, it doesn't really make sense to lazy load this component because if you compare the page size before and after what we did, you realize that we are not actually optimizing the performance, we are reducing it. Because look at the page size here. Currently, it's 47 kilobytes. But if you load the heavy component dynamically, it's going to be less. Take a look. So I'm going to comment out this line and load and import the heavy component statically. Now take a look. Refresh. Here's our page file. Look at the file size. It's 39 kilobytes. So it doesn't make sense to lazy load small components. We should use this technique only for large, heavy components. Okay? Now, let's talk about a few things. When loading components dynamically, as a second argument to the dynamic function, we can pass an options object. Here we can pass a loading function for showing a loading indicator when this component is being downloaded. So we set loading to a function, and here we return, let's say, a simple paragraph and say loading. Now take a look. I click on show. First we see loading and then our component. Beautiful. Now the other property that we have in this options object is SSR. So when importing client components, by default, they're pre-rendered on the server. Sometimes this can cause issues because if you access certain browser APIs on the server, perhaps they are not available and you might end up getting errors. In those situations, you can disable pre-rendering on the server by setting SSR to false. Okay, so this is how we can lazy load client components. Now we can also lazy load external JavaScript libraries. As an example, let's install Lodash. Now, in case you're not familiar with Lodash, it's a very popular utility library for JavaScript. Using Lodash, we can easily manipulate objects and arrays. For example, it gives us a bunch of methods for sorting and filtering arrays and so on. So let's install Lodash. We should also install the type definitions for this library because they are not included here by default. So we should install as a development dependency at types/Lodash. Good. Now, back to our home page. We don't need this heavy component anymore. Let's import Lodash. Typically, we call it underscore. We import it from Lodash. Okay. Now, let's say when the user clicks on this button, we want to sort a list of users. Before we do that, first, let's remove this heavy component. We don't need it anymore. Now, here we add a function. In this function, let's define an array of users. So I set it to an array. Now, for each user, let's just give them a name, C, B, and A. So we want to use Lodash to sort this array. Now, to do that, here we call underscore dot order by. We pass our array, that is users. Then we pass an array of strings that determine the properties we want to use for sorting. In this case, name. This returns our sorted array. Let's log in on the console. Sorted. Good. Now, back in the browser, take a look. All right. Here's our sorted array. Look, we have A, B, C. Beautiful. Now, with this way of importing Lodash, once again, we are including this entire library in our page bundle, so the browser has to download it to render this page. If we don't need this library ahead of time and our page starting to get heavy, then we can lazy load it. To do that, first we should remove this line. Also, we don't need the dynamic function anymore. We don't need the state variable either. Now, to load Lodash dynamically, here we call the import function. So we're calling this in the click handler. This is where we need this library, okay? We call the import function, then we pass Lodash. Now, let's store the result in a constant. Look at the type of this object. It returns a promise. If we await it, we get an object with these properties, default, version, and so on. This is a JavaScript module. So if you await it, we get a module, and first we have to make this async. Now, if we wrap this in parentheses, we can access the properties of that module. And here we pick the default property. So we're picking the default object that is exported from the Lodash module. Now we store the result in a constant called underscore, and our application will work just like before. With this implementation, Lodash is not included in our page bundle ahead of time. It's loaded after we click the show button. To demonstrate that, let's open up DevTools, refresh. and look at this page bundle. Let's search for order by. So this is where we're calling this method, but this is not the implementation of order by in Lodash, because look, this is the only instance of order by in this file. Now, when we click on the show button, we get a separate request sent to the backend to load Lodash. In this bundle, we have the implementation of order by. So there are 11 instances of order by.